Picture a young man on a red horse. He's in his late 20s, maybe just past 30. His beard is short, his face tired in a way that has nothing to do with riding. He's been up most of the night and most of the previous 3 months, negotiating in secret while the city behind him starved. He's riding down a path on the south side of the Alhambra hill, the one the Castilians call the Puerta de los Siete Suelos, the Gate of the Seven Floors. And at the bottom of that path, there's an older man waiting for him on a white horse. The older man is Ferdinand of Aragon. His wife, Isabella of Castile, is a short distance behind him. The two of them have spent 10 years and more money than anyone thought a kingdom had on a single project, taking the city above this path. Today, January 2nd, 1492, they're about to finish. The young man on the red horse reaches the plain. He dismounts. His name is Muhammad al-Thani Ashar, but the Castilians can't pronounce that, so they call him Boabdil, a corruption of Abu Abdillah, and under that name, he'll enter every European history book ever written. He's the last Muslim king in Spain. He's about to stop being a king. He walks across the gap between the two horses, takes Ferdinand's hand, and kisses his arm. Then he holds out his own hand, and in it there are two large iron keys and a gold ring. And in a language Ferdinand doesn't speak, Arabic, he says one sentence. An eyewitness is standing close enough to write it down. His name is Gabriel Rodriguez de Ardila, and this is what he records the young man saying. God loves you very much. These, my lord, are the keys to this paradise. Then Boabdil turns his horse south, toward the al-Hurra mountains, toward the range of hills where he's been promised he can still live as a Muslim under Muslim law, and he rides away. That's where the story usually ends. A weeping king, a handed-over palace, a fallen kingdom. But that isn't where it ends. And the weeping, it turns out, may not have happened at all. This is the story of how a plowman's dynasty, 254 years after it was founded on a red hill by a man in a wool cap, handed over the keys to a paradise it had spent every one of those years building. To understand how Boabdil got to that plain, you have to go back to the household he grew up in. Because the fall of Granada isn't, at its core, a Christian victory. It's a family feud that went on too long in front of the wrong audience. His father is a man history calls al-Hasan Ali, Muley Hassan to the Castilians, and the Sierra Nevada's highest peak is still named after him today. al-Hasan Ali took the throne in 1464. He was a hardliner of a kind the dynasty hadn't seen in a while. After a century of Nasrid rulers paying tribute to Castile, bowing and bending and buying time with silver, al-Hasan Ali decided he was done. In 1477, a Castilian envoy arrived at the Alhambra to collect the annual parillas, the tribute that had been Granada's survival tax since Muhammad al-Awwal's humiliating bargain back in 1246. 231 years of payments. The envoy asked for the money. al-Hasan Ali told him in front of the court that he wouldn't be paying. His exact words, preserved in Castilian chronicles and repeated in almost every modern history of the period, are this. The kings of Granada who paid tribute are dead. Our mint at present coins nothing but blades of scimitars and heads of lances. It's a magnificent line. It's also, if you think about the position Granada was in by 1477, a kind of suicide note. Because Ferdinand and Isabella had just married, the marriage that fused Castile and Aragon into a single political machine. And unlike every Castilian king for the previous century, Ferdinand and Isabella weren't distracted. They weren't fighting each other. They weren't fighting their own nobility. They were sitting in Segovia, looking south, waiting for an excuse. al-Hasan Ali just gave them one. And the tragedy is, he didn't only destroy his dynasty through his foreign policy, he destroyed it through his household. The sources are delicate about this, but the outline's clear. al-Hasan Ali's primary wife was a woman named Aisha al-Hurra. Al-Hurra meaning the free, the noble-born. A woman of the Nasrid royal family in her own right, politically connected, mother of his eldest son, fierce in a way the sources keep circling back to. At some point in the 1470s, al-Hasan Ali took a second wife. A Christian captive, a young woman seized as a child in a border raid, brought to the Alhambra, converted. The Nasrids called her Thuraya, the morning star. The Castilians stubbornly kept her original name, Isabel de Solis, or corrupted it to Thuraya. He wasn't just keeping her as a concubine, he married her. He brought her into the palace as a rival queen, had children with her, and in the late 1470s started favoring her children over Aisha's. Aisha watched, and Aisha planned. Her son was Boabdil, and by 1482 he was about 20 years old, living in the Alhambra with his mother, watching his father drift away from them. Aisha had a faction, which included the Abencerrajes, the Banu Siraj, one of the great aristocratic clans of Granada, who had their own reasons to hate the king. And in July 1482, while al-Hasan Ali was out of the city on campaign, Aisha and the Abencerrajes put her son on the throne. The garrison of the Alhambra simply closed the gates behind the old king and opened them in front of the young one. al-Hasan Ali retreated to Malaga, where his brother Az-Zaval, the Brave, was the governor, and from there he tried to claw the throne back. For the next 3 years, Granada was a kingdom with 2 kings, sometimes 3, fighting each other while Ferdinand and Isabella methodically swallowed the outer cities one by one. This is the household Boabdil grew up in. A father in love with a woman his mother couldn't forgive. A mother who bet everything on her son because she'd been pushed out. An uncle who thought Boabdil was a pawn. A half-brother on the outside of every door. And behind all of it, the knowledge that Castile was building an army that could end all of them. Before we get to the war, though, we have to talk about the gardens. Pull back from the politics for a minute. If you stood on the walls of the Alhambra in the spring of 1483, just after Boabdil had taken the throne, you could look east, uphill, across a shallow ravine, and see another hill with another walled enclosure on it. Smaller, quieter, white-plastered towers rising above cypress and orange trees. A place the Nasrids called Jannatul Arif, the garden of the architect, the garden of the overseer. The translation's a little slippery. In English, we call it the Generalife. It's where the emirs went when they didn't want to be emirs for a few hours. The Generalife was their summer estate, their hunting retreat, their private orchard, built in the early 1300s, expanded under every sultan who followed. A villa separated from the fortress by a narrow valley of almond trees. When you stand in its upper garden today and look back at the Alhambra, it looks like a model city across the way, red walls against the Sierra Nevada, with snow still on the peaks in April. But that isn't what made the Generalife extraordinary. What made it extraordinary was the water. To build any of this in the hills above Granada, you had to solve one problem first. The Darro River runs in the valley hundreds of feet below the palaces, and without an enormous effort, none of that water ever climbs the hill. So the Nasrid engineers, we don't know their names, they don't survive in the record, went upstream, 6 kilometers upstream. They found a bend in the Darro far enough uphill that a slow gradient of 2 to 3 parts per thousand would let water walk, not run, all the way down to the palace complex. There's a phrase in Arabic hydraulic tradition: the water must walk, not run, and the Acequia Real, the royal channel, was built to that rule. A stone channel carrying water from the dam at Jesus del Valle through tunnels and aqueducts into the Generalife first, and from there splitting into dozens of branches that feed every pool and every fountain in the Alhambra. It's been running continuously for 700 years. You can walk up to the dam today and hear the water in the channel. Inside the Generalife, that water does things I can barely describe. The Patio de la Acequia, the court of the channel, is the heart of the estate. A rectangular garden, about 49 meters long and 13 wide, split down its length by a single narrow water channel. Along both sides of the channel, at regular intervals, fine jets of water arch inward across the surface, meeting in the middle, so the whole length of the garden is covered by a canopy of crossing water. You walk down the channel between walls of liquid. Below, on 3 descending terraces, there are orchards and vegetable gardens, because the Generalife was never purely decorative. It was a working farm, feeding the Sultan's household, irrigating lemon and orange and pomegranate and quince. And then there's the Escalera del Agua, the water stairway. It climbs the hill at the back of the estate through a shaded walk of laurel. The stairway has 3 landings, and on each landing there's a small round pool. But what makes it unlike anything else ever built is this. The balustrades on both sides aren't stone rails, they're channels. Narrow troughs cut into the tops of the walls, and water runs down them, fast, white, curling over the edges of small carved spouts at each landing. So that as you walk down the stairway, you are descending with water flowing at your fingertips on your left and your right at the height of your hands. You can reach out in either direction and trail your fingers in it. Step back. The Nasrids are a dynasty always losing. By the 1480s, they've been losing for 2.5 centuries. Their territory has shrunk to a sliver around Granada, Malaga, and Almeria. Their emirs keep murdering each other. And with what little energy they have left, in the decades of their decline, they build this. A walking channel of water that climbs a hill. A walled garden where water forms a roof over your head. A palace that is, in the most literal possible sense, a working paradise. That's the word they used. Not paradise as metaphor, paradise as theology. Open the Quran to Surah 47, verse 15. It describes the garden promised to the righteous. Rivers of water unstaling, rivers of milk whose taste never changes, rivers of wine, a pleasure to the drinkers, rivers of clarified honey, 4 streams, 4 substances converging in the garden. Now go back to the Alhambra. Walk into the Court of the Lions, Muhammad al-Khamis's masterpiece from a century before Boabdil. 4 narrow water channels run from the 4 doorways inward to the central fountain, where 12 lions hold up the marble basin. The 4 channels meet at the center, 4 streams, converging. The palace is a direct translation of the verse into architecture. Not an illusion, a translation. Ibn Zumraq's poetry carved around the rim of the fountain makes the claim explicit. Does not this garden contain wonders the like of which God has forbidden elsewhere to be matched? This is what the Nasrids were doing with the last breath of their dynasty, building a physical argument in stone and water that paradise was real, that their God's promise wasn't something deferred to the next world, but something you could stand in, right now, in a walled garden above a valley, on a hill overlooking a city. In April 1483, while Boabdil's half-brothers were still breathing, and his father was still plotting, and Ferdinand was still bringing up siege engines from the north, someone was walking through the Generalife, trailing fingers in the water on the Escalera del Agua, picking pomegranates from the terraces below the Patio de la Acequia, listening to water cross water in the canopy over the channel. They were walking through paradise, and they were about to lose it. A year after Boabdil seized the Alhambra from his father, he made his worst decision yet. He led a raid into Castilian territory. He wanted a victory. He wanted to prove he wasn't just his mother's creature. He took a force out into the hills near Lucena in April 1483, and he blundered into a Castilian trap. The Count of Cabra ambushed him. The battle was short and confused. Most of his men were killed or scattered. Boabdil himself was pulled off his horse, knocked to the ground, and dragged to a Castilian commander's tent. He was 21 years old. He was in chains. Ferdinand could have held him forever or killed him, but Ferdinand was a more patient operator than that. He looked at the young man in his tent and saw an opportunity nobody in the 10-year war had given him yet. A crowned king of Granada who owed his life to Castile. They cut a deal. Boabdil would be released. He'd go back to Granada as king. In exchange, he'd become a Castilian client, pay tribute, provide troops when called. And if his father and his uncle kept fighting for the throne, Ferdinand would tacitly back him against them, keeping the civil war hot while Castile took the kingdom apart, city by city. Boabdil signed. What else could he do? He went home a king again, but a king everyone now knew was Ferdinand's man. And the civil war got worse, not better, because nobody on the Muslim side trusted him anymore. In 1485, his uncle took advantage of the chaos to depose the blind, dying old king. al-Hasan Ali retreated to Almuñécar on the coast, where he died a few months later, his dynasty collapsing around him. Took over the eastern half of the emirate, declared himself sultan, and treated Boabdil in the capital as an illegitimate usurper. Granada was now 3 pieces. Boabdil in the east, Boabdil in the city, Ferdinand in the camps ringing it all. 2 years later, Ferdinand moved on Malaga. Malaga was the great port of the emirate. Its commander was a man named Hamet el-Zegri, a Nasrid soldier of the older generation, a veteran, not a courtier. When the Castilian army arrived in May 1487, he closed the gates and refused every offer of surrender. What followed became one of the most notorious episodes of the entire Reconquista. Ferdinand ringed the city with trenches and artillery, blockaded the harbor, cut the aqueducts, and waited. Inside the walls, the food ran out first, then the water, then everything else. The Castilian chronicler Hernando del Pulgar, who was there, describes what the defenders were eating as the siege dragged on. Dogs and cats, leaves of vines and palms, chewing hides. People boiled their belts for the salt left in the leather. In August, Hamet el-Zegri finally broke and sued for surrender. Ferdinand accepted, but on a term that would echo across the rest of the war. He refused to grant the city any capitulaciones. He told Hamet el-Zegri that because Malaga had resisted after being given the chance to surrender at the start, the entire population would be treated as the property of the Catholic monarchs. 11,000 people, some sources say 15,000, enslaved on the spot. Men, women, children, divided into 3 lots, a third sold as galley slaves, a third gifted to allies and courtiers across Europe, a third kept for the royal treasury. The city emptied. Ferdinand didn't hide what he was doing. He wanted Granada to hear it, and Granada heard. In December 1489, after another 6-month siege, the Nasrid defenders couldn't possibly win. The city of Baza surrendered. Himself came out to negotiate, accepted Ferdinand's terms: exile, a pension, a small territory in the Alpujarras he promptly sold back to Castile for cash, and crossed to Tlemcen in North Africa, where he'd die, broken and forgotten, in 1494. With gone, Boabdil was the last Nasrid sultan, and the city he ruled was smaller now than it had ever been, smaller than Muhammad's original emirate had been in 1238. Just Granada itself. Just the Alhambra, the Albayzin, the Vega below, and a handful of villages in the mountains. In April 1491, Ferdinand brought his army up to the plain below the city and began to build. He didn't pitch tents, he built a town. Santa Fe, Holy Faith, a fortified square of stone and earth with a cross-shaped street plan, 4 gates, garrison quarters, a church, a bakery, a market. Permanent, durable. A message as clear as Malaga's had been: we aren't going anywhere until you come out. Inside Granada, the refugees from every fallen city had been pouring in for years. The population had swollen, perhaps tripled. Grain was running out. The winter was cold. Friday prayer was still being held in every mosque. The muezzins were still calling 5 times a day. The poetry of Ibn Zumarik was still carved into every wall, and the Acequia Real was still running, silent, patient, feeding the fountains as if nothing were wrong. But everybody in the palace knew Baza was gone, Malaga was gone, the food was gone, and Santa Fe wasn't going anywhere. The only thing left to decide was how it would end. Starting in September 1491, Boabdil began sending emissaries down the hill to Santa Fe in secret. His chief negotiator was Yusuf ibn Kumasha, a senior Nasrid official with a gift for compromise. Ferdinand's side was led by Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the man history would remember as El Gran Capitán, the greatest Spanish general of the Renaissance, who spoke Arabic and had spent his youth reading Muslim military treatises, and who, by the end of these negotiations, would count Boabdil as something close to a friend. For 3 months they met, wrote, and argued over clauses. The document that emerged is called the Capitulaciones de Santa Fe, 67 clauses, signed on November 25, 1491. On paper, it's the most generous surrender any Muslim city received in the 8-century-long Reconquista. Let me walk through the main promises. The people of Granada would retain their mosques untouched. The Waqf endowments, the charitable trusts that funded Muslim social and religious life, would be preserved. Islamic law would continue to apply for Muslim-to-Muslim cases, and Muslim judges, the Qadis, would keep their positions. No Muslim would ever be forced to convert. Anyone who'd already been forced and wished to return to Islam would be given time to reconsider that choice. The call to prayer would continue. The exact wording of the clause is worth noting. No muezzin should be interrupted in the act of calling the people to prayer. Property would be respected. The tax burden would be lightened, not increased. Arabic would remain the language of record. No distinguishing badges would be imposed. A collective amnesty would cover every act committed during the war, and anyone who didn't want to live under Christian rule would be given 3 years of free passage to North Africa on royal ships at minimal cost with their possessions. Boabdil himself would be given the Alpujarras Mountains as a sub-lordship. His family could stay, his faith could stay, his people could stay. On paper, the Capitulaciones preserved Muslim Granada intact, merely shifting the political crown above it. On paper. Boabdil read the document carefully. His chief advisors read it. Aisha, if the later chroniclers are to be believed, read it too, and some say she argued against signing. She wanted resistance. She wanted martyrdom. She wanted what her husband had wanted in 1477, blades of scimitars and heads of lances. Not surrender. Boabdil signed anyway. Here's what he knew. Inside Granada, the population was about 100,000, maybe more with the refugees. There was no food, there was no relief. No army was coming from Morocco, because the Marinids had fallen, and the new Wattasid dynasty in Fez had their own problems. The Ottomans were far away, and Ferdinand had already shown at Malaga what he did to cities that resisted to the end. If Boabdil held out and chose Aisha's path, the best outcome was a Malaga-scale catastrophe, but scaled 10 times up. 100,000 people enslaved, the single largest act of mass enslavement in the history of the Mediterranean. In the kingdom that had spent 250 years carving وَلَا غَالِبَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ into the walls of a palace built as a theological argument for mercy. He signed. The handover was set for January 2nd, 1492. Boabdil moved the date forward from the original spring deadline because he was afraid that if he waited, his own people, driven by hunger, would revolt against the surrender before it could happen. He wanted it done before the city could stop him. So he rode out on a cold winter morning, down the path from the Puerta de los Siete Suelos, across the plain, toward Ferdinand on a white horse. 2 keys and a gold ring in his hand. God loves you very much. These, my lord, are the keys to this paradise. Columbus was in the Santa Fe camp that morning. This is a detail that, almost 6 centuries later, I still find hard to absorb. Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, had been in Spain for years, petitioning the Catholic monarchs to fund his plan to sail west and reach Asia. He'd been rejected by a royal commission, he'd been rejected again. He was living, by early January 1492, in the camp at Santa Fe, waiting for the final word. And it looked like the answer was going to be no. And then, on January 2nd, he stood in the camp and watched the last Muslim king of Spain ride down a hill and hand over the keys to a palace. He opened his shipboard diary, the Diario de a Bordo, a few months later, the log of the voyage that discovered the Americas, with a reference to this exact morning. The first sentence of the first European record of the New World is a reference to the fall of Granada. After your highnesses ended the war of the Moors who reigned in Europe and finished the war in the very great city of Granada, where this present year, on the 2nd January, I saw the royal banners of your highnesses planted by force of arms on the towers of the Alhambra, which is the fortress of the said city. He saw the banners go up, he saw Boabdil come down. The fall of Muslim Spain and the European discovery of America are, in his own writing, linked to the same instant. 10 months later, he'd sailed from Palos. Every maravedi Isabella spent on his expedition had first passed through the war tax on the emirate that just surrendered. The Alhambra paid for Hispaniola. A paradise handed over paid for the destruction of a different paradise on a different continent. All of it rested on the young man on the red horse. He kissed Ferdinand's arm. He handed over the keys and the gold ring. The ring, he said, that had governed Granada since the day it was ruled by the Moors. He mounted his horse and turned south. The Castilian banners went up over the Alhambra walls. The cross rose over the Vela Tower, where there had been a crescent a few hours before. The muezzins didn't call that noon for the first time in 5 centuries. The throne verse on the cedar ceiling of the Hall of the Ambassadors watched in Arabic from a room no Muslim king would ever sit in again. A few miles south of Granada, the road to the Alpujarras climbs up through a pass. On every modern Spanish map, that pass is marked with a name: El Puerto del Suspiro del Moro, the pass of the Moor's sigh. You can drive there today and look back north and see the whole Vega of Granada laid out below you, the city and the Alhambra and the Sierra Nevada behind them, exactly as Boabdil would have seen it in January 1492. The legend says this is where he stopped. The legend says he turned in his saddle and looked back at the city he'd just lost, his entourage around him, his mother Aisha, his family, his retainers. He saw the Castilian banners flying over the fortress his great-great-great-great-grandfather had built. He saw the smoke of the first Christian fires in courtyards where his own cradle had stood, and according to the story, he wept. The legend says Aisha al-Hurra watched him weep, and then, in words that have been repeated by every Spanish schoolchild, carved into every monument, printed in every romantic history of Granada, she said to him, "Weep like a woman for a lost kingdom you did not defend like a man." It's the single most famous quote in the entire story of Muslim Spain. It's almost certainly not true. If Aisha really said those words on that hill, you'd expect to find them in the contemporary sources. In Hernando de Baeza, the Christian interpreter inside Boabdil's court, who wrote an eyewitness account of the surrender. In Hernando del Pulgar, the royal chronicler of Ferdinand and Isabella. in Gabriel Rodriguez de Ardila, who recorded the exact wording of the Keys to Paradise line, in the Arabic sources, al-Makari, who compiled every surviving scrap of Andalusi memory a century later, in the letters of the Catholic monarchs themselves. The line appears in none of them, not one. It first surfaces in any form in a novel, a Spanish historical novel called Guerras Civiles de Granada by Ginés Pérez de Hita, published in 1595, more than 100 years after the surrender. Pérez de Hita was a romantic. He loved the Moors in the way later Europeans would love them, as a beautifully defeated people whose tragedy gave the Spanish conquest a kind of literary grandeur. He wrote scenes, wrote dialogue, invented. From his novel, the line leaks into Spanish ballads, from the ballads into the romantic histories of the 19th century, from the romantic histories into every retelling since. Washington Irving picked it up, every travel writer after Irving picked it up, until by the 20th century it was simply a historical fact, quoted in textbooks, carved into monuments, repeated by tour guides. It's not a historical fact, it's a literary construction. Elizabeth Drayson, who wrote the modern scholarly rehabilitation of Boabdil in 2017, puts the reason with a precision I can't improve on. The last Sigh has long been used by historians to belittle and diminish Boabdil's legacy. The fall of Granada was of such magnitude that a mythical story was needed to explain, accept, or legitimize the immense upheavals the conquest brought about. Think about what she's saying. A weeping king is a weak king. If the last Muslim ruler of Spain broke down crying on a hillside, then the 780 years of Muslim civilization behind him end on a whimper. They end in literary defeat. The conquest becomes natural. The destruction of a world becomes a thing that could only ever have happened the way it happened. A mythical story was needed, because if Boabdil didn't weep, if he rode down from the Alhambra on January 2nd with the composure of a man who had just saved 100,000 lives at the cost of his own reputation, then the story doesn't resolve so cleanly. And he didn't weep. At least no eyewitness says he did. What he did do, we know, because he wrote a letter, a message to the Wattasid Sultan of Fez, explaining his situation and seeking permission to emigrate. The letter is preserved partially in al-Makari's Nafh at-Tib, the encyclopedia of Andalusi memory compiled in Cairo and Damascus 130 years later. This is the voice of Boabdil, in his own words, about what he'd just chosen and why. We, as descendants of Banu al-Ahmar, did not settle for this. Our faith in God does not permit us to reside under the protection of disbelief. We can only accept the protection of our relatives. So we traversed the vast lands and sailed the tumultuous sea, and we hoped that we would not be returned. Read that slowly. This isn't the voice of a coward. This isn't the voice of a man whose mother had to shame him for weakness. This is the voice of a man who's weighed what it costs to remain Muslim against what it costs to remain king, and has chosen the first. He's chosen exile. He's chosen explicitly not to live as a Christian vassal in his own mountains, the way his uncle Azevel briefly tried to. He's writing a polite, formal, pious letter to the most powerful Muslim ruler he can reach, asking for shelter. He'll get it. He'll die in Fez, sometime around 1533, in obscurity and poverty. Al-Makari, writing in Cairo almost a century after Boabdil's death, notes that in his own time, in the 1620s, there were descendants of the last Nasrid sultan still living in Fez, reduced to the charity of the local religious institutions. But the men who rode over the pass with him, the men who made it to Fez, to Tunis, to Cairo and Damascus, they carried something with them. They carried their libraries, their recipes, their trades. They carried the muwashsha and the zajal, the two verse forms that had been invented in Al-Andalus and would shape Arabic poetry for centuries to come. They carried their family trees, which you can still find today in the old Morisco neighborhoods of Tetuan and Saleh and Tunis. Families that still, 500 years later, know they came from Granada. And they carried a memory of what paradise had looked like. Come back with me, one more time, to the hill. January 2nd, 1492. A young man on a red horse, an older man on a white one, 2 keys and a gold ring changing hands. 780 years earlier, a Berber general named Tariq bin Ziyad crossed from Morocco to Spain with about 7,000 men, and in a single summer overran a Visigothic kingdom. The name of the place where he landed? Jebel Tariq. Tariq's mountain becomes in Spanish Gibraltar. 780 years, longer than the Roman Empire's western half. An entire civilization, its libraries, its mosques, its poets, its philosophers, its astronomers, its architects, its silk weavers, its muezzins calling from minarets in Cordoba and Seville and Valencia and Toledo and 100 smaller cities. An entire civilization that rose and held and declined, and on that January morning, on a cold plain below a red hill, ended. Not in battle, not at the edge of a sword, in a negotiation, because a 29-year-old sultan decided he'd rather live as a man than die as a legend. Modern scholarship has been rehabilitating Boabdil for the last 30 years. Elizabeth Drayson, L.P. Harvey, Brian Catlos, Barbara Boloich Gallardo, they've all, in different ways, pushed back against the Spanish romantic tradition that turned him into a weeping weakling. What they argue, and what I think the evidence supports, is that he was the shrewdest realist his dynasty produced in its final generation. That he saw, more clearly than his father or his uncle or his mother, what Malaga had become and what Granada would become if he imitated them. That he chose, knowing the cost to his own name, to take the deal. And here is the hardest part of the story. The deal was broken. Within 7 years, Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros would arrive in Granada, and the capitulaciones, those 67 clauses, those promises about mosques and muezzins and property and language, would start being voided one by one. Forced baptisms would begin. Arabic manuscripts would burn in the Bibarambla Plaza. The muezzin calls would fall silent. The Moriscos, the forcibly converted descendants of the people Boabdil had just saved from enslavement, would spend the next century trying to stay alive as a persecuted minority. And then, in 1609, the last 300,000 of them would be expelled from Spain entirely. All of that is the next episode. But when you blame Boabdil for what followed, and Spanish history has blamed him for 5 centuries, you have to ask yourself a hard question. Was it wrong to sign a treaty because the other side later broke it? Were the 100,000 lives he saved on January 2nd, 1492, worth less than the name he would have kept by getting them killed? He didn't weep on the hill. He wrote a letter. He went to Fez. He died in obscurity. The story of his weakness is a story his enemies needed, not a story his life supports. The last Muslim king of Spain handed over 2 keys to a paradise his ancestors had built over 7 generations, and said, in a language his successor didn't speak, that God loved the man he was handing it to. Maybe he meant it. Maybe it was the politeness of a defeated king. Maybe it was the irony of a man who had just carried his whole civilization down a hill and knew even then that the people below him wouldn't keep their side of the bargain. We can't know. What we know is this. The words, وَلَا غَالِبَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, were still carved 3,000 times into the walls of the palace above him, the palace he'd just handed over. Every fountain still ran. Every Muqarnas cell still caught the light. Every verse of Ibn Zamarak's poetry still spoke, in a language now forbidden, to rooms now empty. The Nasrids had built a working paradise out of the last breath of a dying dynasty, and when the end came, they gave it away rather than watch their people die defending it. Next time, what the Spanish tried to do with a paradise they didn't know what to do with. Cisneros and his fires, Charles V and his cube, Philip II and his expulsions, a French corporal with a burning fuse, an American novelist moving into the ruin, and the building somehow surviving all of them. The afterlife of the Alhambra. I'm Basil. Thanks for listening.